The snow fell in relentless sheets over Detroit, Michigan, on a January night so cold it seemed the city itself had forgotten how to breathe. 17-year-old Evan Taylor crouched in the shadows of an abandoned parking lot, the kind of place where broken dreams collected like the shattered bottles glittering under the dim streetlights. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of a rusted chain-link fence, carrying with it the faint rumble of I-94's late-night traffic, where semis churned through slush and ice, their headlights slicing through the blizzard like chives through fog. Evan's breath fogged in front of him, curling upward, before dissolving into the freezing air, his thin frame shivering beneath a denim jacket that had once belonged to his father, a man who now existed only in memories, and the faint smell of motor oil and cedar that clung to the worn fabric. The jacket was too big for him, its sleeves frayed, and cuffs stained with grease from years of wrench-turning in a garage that no longer existed. But it was the closest thing Evan had to a home. Between his knees rested a backpack, its zipper broken, holding the sum of his worldly possessions, a pair of socks with holes at the heels, a half-empty tube of toothpaste, a dog-eared photo of his dad grinning beside a '67 Mustang, and $6 in crumpled bills, each one counted and recounted, as if hoping they might multiply through sheer desperation. His stomach growled a low, familiar ache that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, and he pressed his back harder against the concrete wall of the lot's lone shelter, a crumbling overhang that barely kept the snow from piling onto his shoulders. The neon sign of a nearby 24-hour diner flickered in the distance, its red glow painting the snowflakes crimson, promising warmth and food that might as well have been on another planet, for all the good it did him. Evan had learned early that places like that didn't welcome kids like him, kids with dirt under their nails and no address to write on a job application. He'd perfected the art of invisibility over the past year, ever since the foster system spat him out, and the streets claimed him, teaching him to avoid cops, social workers, and anyone who looked at him with pity or suspicion, which was just about everyone. The world didn't want boys like Evan, boys who carried their grief like a second skin, who knew too much about survival and too little about hope. He pulled the jacket tighter, his fingers numb as they traced the embroidered name. Daniel stitched over the breast pocket, a reminder of the man who'd taught him how to listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. His dad had been a mechanic, not the kind who worked at shiny chain shops, but the kind who could coax life back into machines everyone else had given up on. "Engines don't lie, Evan," he used to say, his voice warm and steady as he handed over a wrench. "They'll tell you what's wrong if you know how to hear them." That was before the accident, before the fire that turned their garage into a grave, before Evan was left with nothing but a jacket and a handful of lessons about carburetors and courage. Now those lessons were all he had to keep him from freezing in a city that didn't care if he lived or died. He tucked his hands under his armpits, trying to trap what little warmth remained, and watched a stray dog limp across the lot, its ribs stark against its matted fur. Evan knew that look, hunger so deep it hollowed you out, made you forget who you were before the world started taking pieces of you. He wanted to call out to share the half-eaten granola bar in his bag, but the dog was gone before he could move, swallowed by the snow like a ghost. The roar came sudden and sharp, cutting through the storm's wail like a blade. It was a sound Evan knew instantly, one that lived in his bones, from nights spent in his dad's garage, listening to stories about the open road and the men who rode it. A motorcycle, a big one, a Harley, by the sound of it, growled its way into the lot, its headlight a single unblinking eye piercing the blizzard. The bike's chrome gleamed despite the weather reflecting the diner's neon in fractured slivers, and its engine rumbled with a deep, throaty promise of power. But then it coughed, sputtered, and died, with a pathetic wheeze that sounded like surrender. The rider, a hulking figure draped in black leather, slumped over the handlebars, his shoulders heaving as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Evan's first instinct was to shrink deeper into the shadows, to let this stranger's problems stay his own. Getting involved was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when every choice on the street could mean the difference between eating and starving, safety and danger. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, back when he'd tried to help a man who turned out to be a thief, costing Evan the only pair of boots that didn't leak. But something about the rider's posture, the way his head hung low, the way his gloved hands gripped the bars like they were the last thing tethering him to hope, made Evan pause. It was the same look he'd seen in his dad's eyes during those final weeks, when the hospital bills piled up and the doctors stopped promising miracles. It was the look of someone who'd run out of road and didn't know how to keep going. "Hey!" Evan's voice cracked, barely audible over the wind, but it carried across the lot like a lifeline. "Engine trouble." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he cursed himself for it. His survival instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, to let this man deal with his own broken machine. But the rider's head snapped up his face, half hidden by a graying beard and a scarf crusted with ice. His eyes, though sharp and blue as a winter sky, locked onto Evan's with an intensity that made the boy feel seen in a way he hadn't been in months. "Yeah," the man rasped, his voice like gravel ground under a tire. "She's dead, and I'm screwed if I don't get her running by morning." He swung a leg over the bike, his boots crunching in the snow, and Evan noticed the patches on his leather jacket, skulls and flames, and the words, "Iron Reapers," stitched in blood-red thread. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd heard of the Reapers' whispers on the street, about a motorcycle club that didn't just ride, but ruled men who answered to no one, and left stories of fear and loyalty in their wake. Every fiber of Evan's being told him to walk away, to disappear into the storm, before this man decided a homeless kid was more trouble than he was worth. But Evan didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, his sneakers sinking into the snow, and knelt beside the Harley without waiting for permission. His hands, though stiff with cold, moved with a certainty that surprised even him, finding the carburetor, as if guided by his father's ghost. Flooded, he muttered more to himself than to the stranger. "Give me a minute." The man, Frank. He said his name was, though he offered it like it was a secret, watched in silence as Evan worked his fingers deft, despite the numbness creeping into them. The smell of gasoline hit him like a memory sharp and familiar, carrying him back to summer nights in the garage, his dad's laughter mixing with the clink of tools and the hum of a radio playing Johnny Cash. Evan unscrewed the carburetor's cover, his breath catching as he cleaned it with the edge of his sleeve, the fabric soaking up the excess fuel. Frank lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating a face carved with lines of loss and road dust, and started talking, his voice low and rough like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "My boy's getting out of prison tomorrow," he said, exhaling smoke that mingled with the snow. "First time I'll see him in 8 years. 8 damn years, kid, and I can't miss it. Not this time." Evan didn't look up, but he heard the tremble in Frank's voice, the kind of pain that comes from knowing you've failed someone who needed you most. "Why's he in?" Evan asked, before he could stop himself, his hands still working, coaxing the engine back to life. Frank's laugh was bitter like the coffee Evan could never afford at the diner. "Took the fall for me. Stood up for his old man when he shouldn't have. And I let him." The words hung heavy, and Evan felt them settle into his chest, stirring memories of his own dad taking the blame for a busted radiator just to teach him it was okay to mess up. He tightened a bolt, his knuckles scraped raw by the cold metal, and said nothing. What could he say? He knew what it was to carry someone else's mistakes, to feel the weight of love that couldn't save you. He's all I got left. Frank continued softer now, almost lost in the wind. His mom's gone, my folks are gone, and I ain't been much of a father. If I don't show up tomorrow, he'll think I'm just another deadbeat who left him to rot. Evan's throat tightened, and he thought of his own mother who'd chosen a needle over her son, leaving him with nothing but a backpack and a lifetime of questions. Don't do that to him, Evan said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the storm. He didn't look at Frank, didn't dare meet those piercing blue eyes, but his hands never faltered. Don't let him think he's not worth showing up for. Trust me, that kind of hurt doesn't go away. The words burned as they left him tasting of every night he'd spent, wondering why no one came for him, why the world kept turning while he was left behind. He finished cleaning the carburetor, reassembled it with hands that shook from more than just the cold, and stood back as Frank swung a leg over the bike. The Harley roared to life, its engine a deep triumphant bellow that seemed to shake the snow from the air. Frank's face split into a grin, the kind that made him look younger, less broken, and he reached for his wallet, pulling out a wad of bills. "Kid, you're a damn miracle," he said, holding out the money. But Evan stepped back, shaking his head, his pride the only thing the streets hadn't stolen. "Just get to your son," he said, and the words felt like a prayer, one he hadn't known he still believed in. Frank stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Evan's face like he was memorizing it, then nodded once, sharp and final. He gunned the engine, the Harley's growl swallowing the silence, and rode off into the blizzard, leaving Evan alone with the echo of gratitude and the faint warmth of having done something right. As the snow closed in around him, Evan reached into his pocket and found something he hadn't noticed before, a silver ring, heavy and cold with a tiny skull etched into it. It must have fallen from Frank's jacket during the repair, and Evan had picked it up without thinking. He turned it over in his fingers, its weight a reminder of the man who'd looked at him like he was more than just a shadow. He should have given it back, but something stopped him, some small, reckless part of him that wanted to hold on to this moment, this proof that kindness could still mean something. He slipped the ring into his pocket, pulled his dad's jacket tighter, and settled back against the wall, the storm raging on, as if nothing had changed. But something had, and Evan felt it in the pit of his stomach, a spark of hope, fragile and dangerous, that maybe the world wasn't done with him yet. The dawn crept over Detroit, like a thief, reluctant and gray, painting the abandoned parking lot in shades of ash and regret, as the snow from the night before turned to slush underfoot, a treacherous mire that sucked at Evan's sneakers with every step he took in his restless pacing. 17-year-old Evan Taylor hadn't slept. Not really. His body curled into a fetal ball against the crumbling wall, the cold seeping through his father's denim jacket like icy fingers probing for weakness, while his mind replayed the encounter with Frank, over and over a loop of what-ifs and maybes that kept true rest at bay. The silver ring weighed heavy in his pocket, a talisman of the impossible kindness he'd extended, and he fingered it absently, its etched skull a stark reminder that good deeds in a place like this often came with hidden barbs. His stomach was a hollow drum, the granola bar from yesterday long gone, and he eyed the distant diner again, its neon now dimmed by the weak morning light, wondering if he could stretch his $6 for a coffee and a donut, something to chase away the numbness in his limbs and the deeper ache in his chest. The storm had broken some time before sunrise, leaving behind a brittle quiet, broken only by the occasional drip of melting ice from the overhang and the far-off wail of a siren, a sound as much a part of Detroit's symphony as the hum of factory ghosts long silenced. Evan had grown up in this city, or at least the shadow of it, born in the shadow of the Renaissance Center's gleaming towers raised in the grit of the East Side, where his dad fixed cars for neighbors who paid in IOUs and home-cooked meals. But that life had burned away 2 years ago, leaving him adrift in a sea of foster homes that felt more like prisons, places where social workers with clipboards and false smiles catalogued his grief like inventory, shipping him from one indifferent family to the next, until he ran trading walls for the open wound of the streets. He trusted no one now, not fully. Trust was a currency he'd spent and never seen repaid, and the memory of Frank's grateful eyes only made him wary, like spotting a mirage in the desert and wondering if it was laced with poison. He was rummaging in his backpack for the photo of his dad needing that fixed grin to anchor him when the first rumble hit a low vibration that traveled up through the concrete, setting his teeth on edge and stirring the slush into ripples. At first, he thought it was a truck on I-94, one of those 18-wheelers hauling ghosts of the auto industry's glory days. But the sound grew multiplied, a chorus of thunder rolling in from the north, deep and guttural, like the earth itself was growling awake. Evan froze his hand midway to the backpack's flap, heart slamming against his ribs as the noise coalesced into something unmistakable. Motorcycles, dozens of them, no hundreds, their engines, a symphony of raw power that drowned out the city's murmur and made the air thrum with menace. He ducked behind a rusted dumpster, peering out as the horizon filled with them, a phalanx of chrome and leather emerging from the mist like Avengers from some biker apocalypse myth. 150 strong. They rode in tight formation, their bikes gleaming despite the grime of the road, handlebars adorned with skulls and chains, exhaust pipes belching smoke that mingled with the morning fog. At their head was Frank, no longer the slumped figure from the night, but a colossus astride his Harley, his gray beard braided with silver beads that caught the light, his iron reaper's patch, a reaper's scythe slicing through flames prominent on his broad back. The convoy swept into the parking lot like a tidal wave of steel engines, cutting off in unison with a final echoing roar that rattled loose pebbles and set Evan's ears ringing. They didn't rev or peel out. They parked with military precision, row upon row, forming a perimeter around the lot, their riders dismounting in a fluid, practiced motion that spoke of years on the road together. Brothers in arms forged in fire and fury. Evan's breath came shallow and fast, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The ring he'd kept, the ring, maybe they were here to shake him down, to teach a lesson to street rats who touched what wasn't theirs. Or worse, Frank had bragged about the kid who fixed his bike, and now the Reapers wanted free labor or intel or God knew what from a nobody like him. Panic clawed at his throat, memories flooding back, unbidden the foster dad with the belt who disciplined for looking wrong the group home where bigger kids took what little he had and left him bruised and bleeding. These weren't social services. These were wolves in leather men whose reputations preceded them like storm clouds, tales of bar fights that ended in broken bones, runs that smuggled more than just memories across state lines. Frank strode forward, his boots crunching the slush, flanked by two burly riders whose faces were maps of scars and stories, one with a tattooed neck that read, "No Mercy," in jagged script. The air filled with the scent of hot metal and leather polish, undercut by the faint tang of gun oil that made Evan's stomach twist. He pressed himself flatter against the dumpster, willing himself invisible. But Frank's eyes, those sharp blue lasers, scanned the lot and locked onto him unerringly, a slow smile cracking his weathered face like dawn breaking over ruins. "There you are, kid," Frank called, his voice booming across the space, warm and rough as aged whiskey, carrying an undercurrent of command that stilled the murmurs of his brethren. "Knew you'd still be here. Come on out. We ain't here to bite." The words hung in the frosty air, and Evan hesitated, every instinct screaming trap. But the curiosity, that damn spark from last night, pulled him upright. He stepped out slowly, hands visible and empty, his thin frame dwarfed by the sea of giants surrounding him, their gazes a mix of curiosity and appraisal, some nodding approval, others sizing him up like a stray they'd decide whether to feed or chase off. Frank closed the distance in 3 strides, clapping a massive hand on Evan's shoulder, the grip firm but not crushing, grounding him in a way that made the boy's knees buckle slightly. "Boys," Frank announced, turning to the assembled reapers, his voice rising like a preacher's at revival. "This here's Evan Taylor, the kid who pulled my ass out of the fire last night when my ride crapped out and I was set to miss my boy's big day. Without him, I wouldn't have made it to see Tommy walk free. Hell, the wedding wait, no, the release party was something else. Tommy hugged me like I was the prodigal come home, tears in his eyes, saying he knew I'd show. All 'cause of this scrapper here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, low growls of approval turning to cheers, fists pumping the air, boots stomping slush into mud. Evan blinked, overwhelmed, the noise crashing over him like a wave, his cheeks burning under the weight of their regard. These were men who'd stared down cops and rivals, who'd inked loyalty into their skin. And now they were cheering for him, a homeless kid in a threadbare jacket. One by one they approached, not in aggression, but in offering rough hand, pressing folded bills into his palms, 20s and 50s, that multiplied until his pockets bulged more money than he had seen since raiding his dad's tip jar as a kid. Saddlebags flipped open, revealing thermoses of steaming coffee that smelled of heaven, and vanilla creamer foil-wrapped breakfast burritos stuffed with eggs and chorizo, still warm from some pre-dawn cookout. "Eat up, prospect," one growled, a bear of a man with a missing ear and a grin full of gold teeth, shoving a burrito into Evan's hands. Prospect, the word sent a shiver down his spine, implying more than a meal, implying belonging, and Evan recoiled inwardly, even as he bit into the food, the flavors exploding on his tongue, chasing away the hunger with a vengeance. Coats were shrugged off massive shoulders, heavy leather vests, lined with flannel, draped over his slim frame, their weight a armor against the cold. And something deeper, the isolation that had been his constant companion. Women were among them too, not hangers-on, but full members, their cuts bearing the same reaper emblem, hair cropped short or braided, long eyes, hard but kind in their assessment. One, a wiry woman with a streak of purple in her black hair and a scar bisecting her lip, hung back, at first watching Evan with an intensity that made him fidget. Lena Frank introduced her later, but in that moment she was just a stranger who saw too much. As the crowd thinned slightly, giving space for the boy to breathe, she stepped forward, her boots silent on the slush, and knelt to his level, her voice a low rasp, honed by cigarettes and screams. "You remind me of my Mikey," she said. No preamble, her eyes hazel flecked with gold, glistening with unshed tears that she blinked away fierce. "Lost him 3 years back to the needle, same age as you. Skinny kid with hands that could fix anything, bikes, hearts, you name it. Thought the world of him, but the streets, they take what they want, don't they? Saw you last night." Frank radioed ahead, said you had that same light in your eyes, the one that says you ain't broken yet. Evan swallowed hard, the burrito turning to ash in his mouth, memories of his own losses crashing in the dad who'd promised forever, but delivered a coffin the mom who'd vanished into shadows. I'm sorry, he managed, voice cracking, and Lena shook her head, reaching out to squeeze his hand, her grip calloused and sure. Don't be. Just don't let him take you too. We Reapers, we look out for our own. Mikey's ghost would want that for you. Her words pierced him a bridge across the chasm of shared sorrow, and for the first time in months, Evan felt seen not as a problem to solve or a burden to bear, but as a soul worth salvaging. The morning wore on, the Reapers turning the lot into a makeshift camp, stories exchanged over coffee mugs, laughter booming as Frank recounted the repair with exaggerated flair, painting Evan as some garage wizard conjured from the storm. But beneath the camaraderie, Evan's mind churned. The fear not fully quelled. These gifts came with strings invisible, but taut, pulling him toward a world of ink and engines of brotherhood that demanded blood oaths and blind faith. He remembered the foster system's honeyed traps, promises of family that ended in locked doors and whispered threats, and he wondered if this was just a prettier cage. As the group began to pack up engines, coughing back to life in a staggered rhythm, Frank pulled him aside away from the throng, his expression turning serious, the lines around his eyes deepening like cracks in old leather. "Listen, Evan," he said, voice low, so only the boy could hear. "You saved more than my bike last night. You gave me a shot at being the dad Tommy deserves, and for that, I owe you, big time. My shop in Chicago Reaper's Forge. It's more than wrenches and welds. It's a place for guys like you kids, the world chewed up and spat out. Room upstairs, steady pay brothers who got your back. Come on down. Bus leaves the station in 2 hours. I'll spot the ticket." The offer hung between them, golden and perilous, a lifeline or a noose depending on the angle. Evan's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around the ring, its cool metal, a question he couldn't yet answer. Chicago was a world away, a city of wind and wonders, but it meant leaving the ghosts of Detroit behind, risking the vulnerability of trust in men who wore death on their sleeves. I don't know," he stammered, eyes dropping to the slush where boot prints mingled like a chaotic map of possibilities. "What if it's not? What if I can't?" Frank's hand returned to his shoulder, steady as an anchor. "Then you walk. No chains here, kid. But think on it. World's full of folks who'll use you up, but Reapers, we repay debts. And you, Evan Taylor, you got one coming that's gonna change everything." With that, Frank clapped him on the back once more, striding to his bike as the engines roared anew, the convoy assembling like a beast stirring from slumber. They rode out as they came, a thunderous exodus that shook the lot, and Evan's bones leaving behind a wake of warmth and wonder, and the echo of an invitation that whispered of roads untaken. Evan stood alone in the sudden silence, pockets heavy with fortune heart, heavier with doubt, the silver ring burning against his thigh like a brand of fate undecided. The bus station in Detroit smelled of diesel fumes and despair, a cavernous space where fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects, and the air hung heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 hurried goodbyes. 17-year-old Evan Taylor stood at the edge of the platform, his father's denim jacket pulled tight against the January chill that seeped through the cracked windows, his backpack slung over one shoulder, its weight a reminder of how little he carried into this leap of faith. The silver ring from Frank Iron Callahan burned in his pocket, a talisman of the choice he'd made just hours ago, when the echo of 150 Iron Reaper's engines still vibrated in his chest, their unexpected gratitude transforming the abandoned parking lot into a stage for a miracle he hadn't dared believe in. The crumpled bus ticket in his hand, paid for, by Frank's insistent generosity, promised passage to Chicago, a city he'd only seen in his dad's stories, a place of towering steel and winds that cut sharper than Detroit's winters. Evan's breath fogged in the cold, his sneakers scuffing the grimy tile as he paced the $6 in his pocket, now joined by the wad of bills from the reapers, enough to buy a hot meal or two, but not enough to quiet the doubts clawing at his mind. What was he doing boarding a bus to follow a biker he'd known for less than a day, a man whose leather cut bore the emblem of a club that lived outside the law? The reapers had called him prospect, a word that tasted of belonging but smelled of obligation, and Evan knew too well the cost of trusting promises. Foster homes with locked pantries, caseworkers who forgot his name, a mother who'd traded him for a hit. Yet Frank's eyes, those piercing blue beacons, had held something Evan hadn't seen since his dad's last smile belief, not in what he could take, but in what Evan could give. So here he was, ticket clutched like a lifeline, stepping onto a Greyhound bound for a city that might hold a future, or just another betrayal. The bus was half empty, its seats worn and stained, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and someone's cheap cologne. Evan slid into a window seat near the back, the glass cold against his cheek, as he watched Detroit recede its skyline, a jagged silhouette against the gray sky factories and tenements blurring into memory. His fingers traced the embroidered name, Daniel, on his jacket, and he closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engine pull him back to the garage on Livernois Avenue where his dad had taught him to listen to a car's heartbeat. "Engines are honest," Evan Daniel used to say, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that never got clean. "They don't hide their pain. You just gotta know where to look." That was before the accident, before a faulty gas line turned their garage into an inferno, before Evan watched his dad's life burn away in a hospital bed, leaving him with nothing but a jacket and a toolbox of skills no one seemed to want. The memory stung sharp as the wind outside, and Evan opened his eyes to find a man staring at him from across the aisle. An older guy, maybe 60, with a face like weathered oak and hands knotted with arthritis, clutching a thermos that smelled faintly of whiskey. "You got that look, kid," the man said, his voice a low rasp, like sandpaper on wood. "Like you're running from something but don't know what you're running to." Evan stiffened his hand, tightening around the ring in his pocket, but the man's eyes were kind, crinkled at the edges, and he offered a sip from the thermos with a crooked smile. "Name's Walt. Used to wrench on bikes back in the day, Harleys mostly. You a gearhead?" The question caught Evan off guard, and he nodded before he could stop himself, the words spilling out like oil from a cracked pan. "My dad taught me. Cars, bikes, anything with an engine. He said, they talk if you listen right." Walt's laugh was a dry chuckle, and he leaned closer, his breath warm with liquor and nostalgia. "Damn straight they do. Fixed my first chopper in '72, a panhead that sang sweeter than my ex-wife. You headed somewhere to use those hands or just driftin'?" Evan hesitated, the weight of the question pressing against the walls he'd built to keep the world out. "Chicago," he said, finally, the word tasting foreign, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Got a guy there says he's got work. Runs a garage." Walt's eyebrows rose, and he tilted his head, studying Evan like a blueprint. "Chicago, huh? Rough town, but good for second chances if you find the right crew. Who's this guy? Some grease monkey like us?" Evan's lips twitched, a half-smile breaking through despite himself. "Frank Callahan. Calls himself Iron. Rides with the Iron Reapers." Walt's eyes widened just for a moment, before he let out a low whistle, the sound carrying a mix of respect and wariness. "Reapers, huh? Those boys don't play. Loyal as hell, but cross 'em and you're done. Callahan's their prez or close to it heard he did time for protecting his own, took a hit to keep his kid out of the fire. That the guy... Evan nodded, his heart skipping, as Walt's words sank in, painting Frank in shades of sacrifice and shadow. He hadn't known about the prison time, only the pain in Frank's voice when he spoke of his son Tommy and the debt he owed for 8 years lost. The revelation stirred something in Evan, a flicker of recognition. He knew what it was to carry someone else's choices, to feel the weight of love that couldn't undo the past. His mother's face flashed in his mind, her eyes glassy and distant, promising she'd be back after one last score, a promise broken before the door closed behind her. He pushed the thought away, focusing on Walt's thermos, the warmth of it in his hands as he took a cautious sip, the whiskey burning a path to his empty stomach. The bus rumbled on, crossing the Michigan border into Indiana, the landscape shifting from urban decay to flat, snow-dusted fields that stretched like a blank page waiting for a story. Walt kept talking, his voice a steady anchor, spinning tales of his days as a mechanic of bikes he'd rebuilt for riders who paid in cash, or curses of a life spent chasing freedom on 2 wheels. "Ever think about it, kid?" he asked, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Riding out wind in your face, no one telling you where to be. That's what got me into bikes. Felt like I could outrun anything. Bill's heartbreak, you name it." Evan's chest tightened, the image stirring a longing he hadn't let himself feel since he was a kid, sprawled on the garage floor, dreaming of roads that led nowhere and everywhere. "Yeah," he admitted, voice soft, "used to think I'd ride with my dad someday. Fix up an old knucklehead, hit the highway. Never got the chance." Walt's face softened, and he reached across the aisle, his hand steady, despite the arthritis, to pat Evan's knee. "You'll get your shot, kid. Those hands of yours, they're made for more than just survivin'. You got the spark, same as your old man, I bet. Don't let it go out." The words hit Evan like a wrench to the chest, cracking open something he'd kept locked since the fire, hope fragile and dangerous that he might still be more than the sum of his losses. As the bus rolled into Chicago, the skyline rose like a fortress of glass and steel. The Sears Tower Willis now, but Walt called it by its old name, piercing the clouds like a challenge. Evan's heart raced the city, both a promise and a threat, its streets alive with the pulse of possibility and peril. Walt scribbled a number on a napkin, pressing it into Evan's hand, hand with a grin. "You ever need a washed-up wrench to talk shop, you call. And watch yourself with those reapers, kid. They're family, but family's complicated." Evan nodded, tucking the napkin into his pocket beside the ring, the weight of both grounding him as he stepped off the bus into the biting wind of the loop. The address Frank had given him led to a gritty corner of the South Side where Reaper's Forge stood, a brick building with a neon sign shaped like a scythe, its glow cutting through the dusk. The garage doors were open, revealing a cavern of tools and bikes, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. A symphony of clanks and curses from mechanics at work. Frank stood at the center, his leather cut replaced by a grease-stained apron, but his presence no less commanding. He spotted Evan and broke into a grin, striding over to clap him on the shoulder, the gesture familiar, now almost paternal. "Knew you'd show, kid," he said, his voice warm but edged with expectation. "Welcome to the Forge. This ain't just a shop, it's a home for strays like us. You ready to get those hands dirty?" Evan looked around at the bikes lined up like soldiers, at the men and women who nodded his way, their eyes assessing, but not unkind. The fear was still there, a knot in his gut whispering of traps and broken promises, but so was the spark Walt had seen, the one his dad had nurtured, the one that said he could still build something from the wreckage of his life. He nodded the ring in his pocket, a quiet reminder of the road that led him here, and stepped into the garage, the clang of metal and the hum of engines welcoming him like a language he'd always known, a language that might just lead him home. The air inside Reaper's forge was thick with the scent of motor oil and steel, a heady mix that clung to Evan Taylor's skin like a second jacket. As he stood in the heart of the Chicago garage, his hands already smudged with grease after just 3 days under its roof. At 17, Evan had known plenty of places that claimed to be homes foster placements with starched sheets and locked refrigerators, group homes where laughter was a rare currency. But none had felt like this, a cavern of clanging tools and roaring engines where the walls seemed to pulse with purpose. The neon scythe above the entrance cast a red glow across the concrete floor, illuminating rows of motorcycles in various states of repair, from gleaming Harleys to battered choppers that looked like they'd ridden through hell and back. Frank Iron Callahan's voice boomed over the din, directing mechanics with the precision of a general. His leather cut swapped for a worn apron that bore the scars of 1,000 oil spills. Evan's dad's jacket hung on a hook by the workbench, replaced by a borrowed flannel shirt that smelled of someone else's sweat and resolve, but he kept the silver ring in his pocket, its etched skull a quiet anchor as he navigated this new world. The room upstairs, a Spartan space with a cot and a single bulb, was more than he'd had in Detroit, and the promise of steady pay kept his stomach full. But the weight of belonging here with the Iron Reapers, a brotherhood forged in leather and loyalty, pressed against him both a comfort and a challenge. He'd spent his life running from ties that could bind, yet every wrench he turned, every carburetor he cleaned felt like a step toward something he couldn't name, something that scared him as much as it called to him. The garage was alive with motion, a symphony of sparks and curses, as mechanics worked on bikes for the Reaper's upcoming 20th anniversary, run a ritual Frank had described with a reverence usually reserved for church. Evan's task was a 1978 shovelhead, its engine seized and its chrome dulled by years of neglect. A bike that belonged to the club's founder, a legend named Red, who'd died on a run a decade ago, leaving behind a legacy etched in every patch and scar the Reapers wore. "Fix her up, Kid Frank," had said, his blue eyes gleaming with expectation. "Red's bike is our heart. You get her running for the anniversary. You're not just a guest here, you're family." The word hit Evan like a spark plug to the chest, igniting memories of his dad's garage of late nights spent polishing parts while Daniel spun tales of the road. But family was a dangerous word, one that had burned him before, and as he knelt beside the shovelhead, his hands tracing its rusted lines, he felt the eyes of the garage on him, some warm, some wary, all waiting to see if he'd earn his place. Among them was Tommy Frank's son, fresh out of prison and leaner than Evan had imagined, his face a mirror of his father's, but harder edged with 8 years of bars and bitterness. Tommy worked across the garage, his movements sharp and efficient, but his glances at Evan were knives glinting with something that wasn't quite hate, but wasn't far off. Lena the Reaper, with the purple-streaked hair, and the ghost of her son Mikey in her eyes, had warned Evan about Tommy's resentment, how he saw the kid as an intruder, a stray stealing the attention he'd fought years to reclaim from his father. Evan kept his head down, focusing on the shovelhead's clogged fuel lines, but the tension hung like exhaust, thick and inescapable. The days blurred into a rhythm of work and wary camaraderie. The Reapers taught Evan their ways, not just how to rebuild an engine, but how to listen to it, to feel its pulse through the handlebars, to understand a bike as a living thing. Lena showed him how to balance a carburetor with a piece of hose, and a steady hand, her laughter rough but kind when he fumbled. Others, like Bear, the gold-toothed giant from the parking lot, shared stories of runs across the Dakotas, of nights under stars that felt closer than the world below. But Tommy remained a shadow, his silence louder than the garage's din, his presence a reminder that family wasn't given, it was earned and sometimes fought for. One evening, as the sun bled orange through the garage's high windows, Tommy cornered Evan by the tool rack, his voice low and sharp. "You think you're one of us, kid? Fixin' a few bikes don't make you a reaper. You don't know what it costs to wear this patch." His finger jabbed at the scythe on his chest, his eyes burning with a pain. Evan recognized abandonment, the kind that festers when the people you need choose something else. Evan's throat tightened, memories of his mother's last promise flashing like a busted headlight. But he stood his ground, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I'm not trying to take your place," he said, voice quiet but firm. "I'm just trying to find mine." Tommy's jaw clenched, and for a moment Evan braced for a fist. But the older man just turned away, leaving a sting of unresolved anger in the air. The anniversary run loomed, and the shovelhead became Evan's obsession, its stubborn engine a puzzle he was determined to solve. Late at night, when the garage emptied and the city's hum softened, he worked alone, the neon scythe casting long shadows across the bike's frame. He found a crack in the piston, a flaw hidden deep in the engine's heart, and spent hours machining a replacement, his hands guided by his dad's lessons and a stubborn refusal to fail. But the real test came the night before the run, when a fight broke out in the garage. A dispute over a botched deal, whispers of a rival club sniffing too close to Reaper territory. Voices rose, fists clenched, and Evan saw Tommy at the center, his anger spilling over, accusing Frank of prioritizing the kid over the club's safety. The garage crackled with tension, a spark away from violence, and Evan felt the weight of his presence, the outsider who'd stirred the pot without meaning to. He stepped forward, heart pounding, and held up the shovelhead's key, its metal gleaming under the neon. "She's ready," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Red's bike runs. I fixed her for tomorrow, for all of you." The room stilled, eyes turning to him, and Frank's face broke into a grin, pride shining through the storm. Tommy's glare softened just a fraction as Evan started the shovelhead, its roar filling the garage like a hymn, a sound that spoke of history and hope, of a founder's dream kept alive. The run came at dawn, 100 bikes rolling out under a sky. Bruised purple, the shovelhead at the front, Evan riding pillion behind Frank, the wind tearing through his borrowed leather vest. The Reapers rode as one, their engines a thunder that shook the Chicago streets, and Evan felt it, the pulse of belonging. Fragile but real, a family not born of blood, but of shared scars and second chances. At the rally point, a lakefront lot where the Reapers gathered to honor Red Tommy, approached his face unreadable. He held out a wrench, its handle worn smooth by years of use, and nodded once. "Good work, kid," he said, the words grudging but honest. "Red would have liked you." Evan took the wrench, its weight a promise, and felt the ring in his pocket pulse like a heartbeat. As the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the bikes in gold, he looked at Frank, at Lena, at the Reapers, who'd seen him not as a throwaway, but as one of their own. The neon scythe flickered above the garage when they returned its light, a beacon in the dusk, and Evan stood under it, his dad's photo and Walt's napkin tucked beside the ring. A constellation of reminders that he'd found a home, not in a place, but in the sound of engines turning over, in the hands that reached out to pull him from the dark, in the family that chose him when he had nothing left to give.